Hi guys, I've got some really cool wines to share with you today. Today I want to talk you through some Greek wines. So I've got the same producer of these two, which is Xinomavro. So we've got a Xinomavro and an Assyrtiko. My pronunciation, as you know when you watch my videos, it's not great. I've got another domain as well. It's actually owned by Xinomavro. So all fantastic wines. Weak wines is something that collective are really moving towards, and I want to share why. So really high quality, great structure for aging. You've got high acidity, high tannin. The reds, you've got high acid, whites. So Greek wines are at the moment undervalued, and what I mean by that is the price really doesn't reflect the level of quality. So a lot of these wines do punch well above their weight in terms of value for money, but the market hasn't quite caught up on that yet. So I want to talk you through a little bit about Greece in terms of a wine region, and then we're going to dive into each of these wines. So Greece is a really interesting region for wines. It is a Mediterranean climate, as you know, it's hot, and you do have cool climate reflected type styles. So high altitude is one of those cooling influences, which means that even though we're in a hot climate, as we move higher up, that elevation, that becomes a cooling influence of altitude that is essentially bringing that temperature down, allowing us to lengthen that grape life in a period, which means that acid levels drop more slowly, sugar levels rise more slowly. And that means that we tend to have a riper style of grape, but we have that high acidity as well, which gives it that structure, as I said at the start, to be able to age. Part of the region is Santorini. Santorini is an island, as you know, and it is a volcanic windswept island. It's really well known for Assyrtiko. So that is actually where this wine comes from. And what's really interesting about it is they train the vines in a really unique way. So volcanic windswept island, we're wanting to protect from the wind. They actually train the vine in a basket. So a circular basket where the berries actually grow inward, and it's really, really low to the ground. I'll bring up an image because it's really quite fascinating to see. So that is actually something that I find particularly interesting about Santorini as a region and how they train their vines, because it's something that you don't typically see in other parts of the world, even other parts that do also need to protect the vines from the wind. So really keen to get into this one and try it, but I do want to talk you through the other ones that I have as well. So same producer, Kiriani, that now owns domain, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Sagalis. So also an Assyrtiko. So this is a white grape, but it's actually on the mainland. So up near Macedonia, so up in the northern part of Greece, high altitude. So you have a lot of minerality with both wines, but slightly different styles. And I'm really interested to sort of talk you through that as I open the wine. And I also want to talk you through the Xinomavro. So if you know Greek wines, you will most likely have already heard of Xinomavro, perhaps even tried it. It's known as the Greek version of Nebbiolo. If you like your Nebbiolos, this is a wine for you. If you haven't heard of them before, Nebbiolo is an Italian grape variety. It is from the northern part of Italy. You probably have heard of, or may have heard of, Barolo. That is the region which typically grows Nebbiolo, the grape variety. Now, Nebbiolo is really high acid, really high tannin, great structure to it. I personally love a Nebbiolo, and I absolutely love Xinomavro because it also has that high tannin, high acid structure. So this is a wine that can age. This is a really interesting wine though, and I want to talk you through that because it actually presents, when you first put it in the glass, as an older style wine. And what I mean by that is usually a young grape, red grape, the color will be sort of purple, and as it ages, it goes to brown. Xinomavro actually presents like an old wine, even in its use. And it's really interesting as well because when you have a wine that ages, you typically, when it's young, you start with a lot of primary or secondary flavors. Primary are the flavors that come from the grape or the terroir, so the environment that grape is grown in. The secondary characteristics or flavors are what come from the winemaking process, so whether they use tanks or oak, so different winemaking processes actually influence some of the flavor that we'll have in the wine. And when a wine ages, we start to get what's called tertiary flavors and characteristics, which are essentially from bottle aging. So it's when oxygen is interacting with the wine, so coming through the cork and influencing that flavor. It's essentially a chemical reaction that's happening over time. And that's how a wine evolves if it's got the structure to evolve, so that ageability. And when we have a wine that is going through that sort of aging process, we go from having those primary and secondary flavors as dominant to actually taking a back seat, and we have the tertiary flavors that start to evolve and actually take over. You've probably heard of a drink window. As we move through that drink window, that flavor profile changes. And when we get to the later side of that drink window or past the drink window, we are more prominent on those tertiary characteristics. Why I'm explaining that is Xinomavro is really interesting in that the fruit takes a back seat from the get-go. Really fascinating to actually try it. Even if you turn out not to be a fan of Xinomavro, it's fascinating in terms of understanding wine and what actually happens with flavor. So to be able to kind of get the feel of an older style wine at its youth is really interesting if you want to learn a little bit more about how wines evolve. The other thing that's really interesting is I had this wine with moussaka, which paired beautifully. Obviously, Greek wine tends to go with Greek food, so it's quite easy to pair regional wines with the style of food that that country has. But what was really interesting is having the meat in that moussaka actually pulled the fruit forward a little bit. Not a huge amount, but noticeably. And that's really why they suggest to pair red wines with things like steak, because essentially tannin binds to the proteins in our saliva. That's what actually gives it the grippy feeling in our mouth. So when we have a steak, the tannins bind to the proteins in the steak and not as much to our saliva, which basically means that it takes some of that grippiness, and that's why we taste more of the fruit. So it's really interesting when you're having a wine where the fruit is definitely in the background, but then you have a little bit of meat with it and it does pull it forward a little bit. Not much, as I said, but enough to be noticeable to actually see the difference in the wine before and after food and before and after having meat. I'm really keen to get into all of these wines. I also want to show you a synthetic cork because this producer does have a synthetic cork. If you haven't seen a synthetic cork, they are really quite interesting. They kind of look like a cork, but they look a little bit like plasticky. You can get good quality, not so good quality synthetic corks. Whatever you do, do not use a paraffin on them because it will mess up the system. So I will be pulling these two corks, but I have put a paraffin on this one because it's a screw cap. So synthetic corks are essentially trying to remove the faults that we sometimes get with corks. So cork taint basically makes the wine smell like wet cardboard. Also a faulty cork as well can damage the wine because you're either getting too little air or too much air. So it can either become very oxidative. So it kind of tastes like you've left the wine out on a kitchen bench overnight and then picked it up the next morning. Or it can have very little oxygen, which makes it reductive. So it tastes a little bit like vinegar. None of those options are great, which is why, winemakers have been experimenting with different seals. We've got the screw cap as well, which was also trying to preserve more of those characteristics, like fruit characteristics or varietal characteristics. So, really interesting to see a synthetic cork. These were actually the first ones that I had ever seen, so it was really interesting to me. This is a synthetic cork. So I'm not sure if it quite comes up in the video, but it does look like a cork, but just a little bit plasticky is probably the best way that I can describe it. Okay, so let's get tasting these other wines. So we've got the Assyrtiko from up in the north in Macedonia. You can see that it says high altitude wine on the label. Ooh. Really nice smell. Stone fruits, crushed stone, very mineral It's got a nice lemon flavour to it. It's quite light. Really interested to taste that now against the Assyrtiko from Santorini. Much more subtle on the nose. Much more sea spray, like crushed oyster shells on the nose. Definitely more acidic. You can definitely tell the difference. The higher altitude, the stone fruits come through a lot more. They're probably the focal point with a little bit of minerality. The difference in the one with Santorini, so same grape, just different parts of Greece. The Assyrtiko, made from Santorini, much more acidity, like chalk and cheese in terms of how noticeable it is, how much softer that is. When I first tried it, you still got that acidity, but side by side, it's definitely the Assyrtiko from Santorini is far more acidic. In a really nice way, though. I think with seafood, this would be fantastic. You're getting so much crushed oyster shells on the palate and also on the nose. There's a little bit of oiliness as well on the palate that I didn't get with the Assyrtiko that was from Amidon, the one up north. So very different, not as oily on the palate. This feels more warm climate. Little bit of sort of the cooling influence, obviously with the altitude and the acidity that does come through. But side by side, this one definitely feels more ripe, like ripe in terms of softer. The Santorini, the fruit is still ripe, but the acidity just, yeah, it definitely is the focal point. Whereas the acidity in the Assyrtiko from the mainland up north, it's the fruit definitely feels softer, more ripe, probably more water content, I'm going to say, if I had to guess. Not to say that it's diluting, but it's definitely, I'd say, riper. I think the longer ripening period would have fully ripened that grape. As grapes ripen, they do tend to swell up with water. So perhaps that's why it's softer on the palate. Going back to it, still a lot of acidity, but those stone fruits are much more pronounced on the palate and even on the nose than the Santorini. I think I personally prefer the one from Santorini. I love a wine with high acidity. I love a mineral drive. So this, for me, is really nice. I think probably with some age that acidity would soften. The stone fruits will probably come through a little bit more. So I'd be interested to see what this is like in a little bit more time. Two really interesting takes on the same grape variety. So I just want to recap. We've got the one that is from the mainland, high altitude, much more soft on the palate. And then we've got the Assyrtiko from Santorini, volcanic windswept island, where the grapes are trained in a basket, much more noticeable in terms of acidity, really high acidity, really high mineral drive. The stone fruits definitely take backseat to that crushed oyster minerality sea spray that you're getting, a little bit oily on the palate. Really interesting. It's an interesting wine with seafood, and I think with oysters, there would be a really good pairing. So we've done the whites. Now we're on to the Xinomavro. So as I said, I find this such a fascinating wine. I absolutely love a Nebbiolo. As I said, Nebbiolo is from the northern part of Italy, usually in a region called Barolo or Lani, depending on the classification. There are some others as well, but Nebbiolo is the grape variety in those regions, really high acid, really high tannin, great build-to-age structure. But as I said, it is a really interesting wine in that it presents like an older style wine even in its youth. So sour cherry, strawberry, there's a little bit of spice that you can smell in there. Really interesting. Oh, so tannic, so acidic. You can see by the way that I'm like trying to regain some saliva in my mouth because that has just taken all of it. But oh, I love a red wine that is high acid, high tannin. This ticks so many boxes for me. This is fantastic. Structurally, it's so balanced. Beautiful tannin structure. Super acidic. Fruit is definitely in the background. The tannin and acid are way in front. A little bit of earthiness, a little bit of tobacco. Not very many tertiary notes coming through. Mainly because the acid and the tannin are just the star. And for me, they are the star. I really love a wine with high acid, high tannin. The nose, definitely more sour cherries, not as much on the palate. Just so acidic, but in such a nice way. It almost makes it moreish. The length to this, so long. Still getting all of the flavour. As I said, the first on the front palate, the fruit is not there. Definitely take the back seat. As the length continues, you do get some more hints of fruit. Definitely coming through. Such a nice wine. This would be fantastic with a steak. As I said, I paired it with Moussaka. That was brilliant. Such a good pairing. Definitely softens the tannins when you have it with some meat. I'm obviously having it without fruit, so it's much more noticeable. But the length, and the fruit at the very end definitely comes through. Definitely not at the fore, but there's so much flavour. That's the spice, the cherries, the strawberry, the tobacco, a little bit of earthiness in there. The length is still going. This is a sensational wine. Fantastic producer. This producer is gaining international recognition. They've won a bunch of awards. The quality really shows. Two very different styles of Assyrtiko, but the Xinomavro, just sensational. Cheers.